Also doubling down in his spat with Canada over a television ad that uses audio of former President Ronald Reagan denouncing tariffs, saying he is punishing the country with an additional 10% tariff hike. Trump said the ad, which first aired during the American League Championship Series last week, was a, quote, fraud and a hostile act. And he accused Ontario of misrepresenting Reagan's stance. However, as we've been taking pains to note, the audio used in the ad was authentic, and minor edits to Reagan's original 1987 address simply did not alter the substance of his remarks, which were highly critical of the consequences of tariffs. The speech was explaining his decision to impose duties on Japanese goods. Ontario Premier Doug Ford pledged in a social media post to pull the ad after the weekend, with it still airing in the United States during the first two World Series games, Friday and Saturday games that, of course, just happened to be played in Toronto. Trump suspended months-long trade talks with Canada, the U.S.'s second-largest trading partner, on Thursday night because of that ad. It's not clear what goods will be affected by Trump's newly announced tariffs. And Joe, you hit the nail right on the head at the top of the hour here. The president's team will be arguing before the Supreme Court that these tariffs, that he has the authority to impose tariffs. Usually that's done by Congress. Right. He's doing it because it's a national emergency. And yet, he has made it couldn't be clearer here that he's doing it because his feelings were hurt because of an ad put together by the province of Ontario.
Well, exactly. And again, good luck going even before this Supreme Court and arguing that these are based on emergencies. Everything is an emergency this term with Donald Trump. And, you know, an emergency because of an ad that quotes Ronald Reagan accurately and his views on tariffs. That's an emergency? No, I don't think so. Not having China move along the way he wants on a geopolitical disagreement regarding a war in Russia, that's an economic emergency that requires 130%. No, not at all. I mean, the emergency argument has always been specious at best. Now it's just been laid bare, especially with what happened over the past couple days, with Canada actually accurately quoting Ronald Reagan. The Wall Street Journal editorial board weighed in on a piece called Reagan versus Trump on Tariffs, which reads in part, quote, Mr. Trump is wrong about the Reagan speech. And he was wrong when he said on social media that, quote, Ronald Reagan loved tariffs for purposes of national security and the economy. The Gipper was a free trader. In that 1987 speech, Reagan was trying to explain why he was making an exception to his free trade policies on semiconductor imports from Japan. It is a shame, and my God, do I not? I agree with this 1,000%. The Wall Street Journal writes, it is a shame to see the Reagan Foundation, of all places, indulging Mr. Trump speak with its statement saying the speech was taken out of context. Anyone who reads the whole speech can see the Gipper favored free trade with rare exceptions for political pragmatism and national security. Mr. Trump's been fortunate that his tariffs haven't triggered much retaliation, which has spared us from a global trade war. But the tariffs are doing economic damage by raising costs for consumers and businesses and by dampening animal spirits that should be soaring with this tax bill and deregulation. The Wall Street Journal editorial page goes on to say he can boast about tariffs all he wants, but he shouldn't get away with taking Reagan's trade beliefs in vain. The ultimate sin, the unforgivable sin for the Wall Street Journal editorial page, Maura. But again, as I explained the other day, because I'm such a dork, I actually, before the show last week, I stayed up, I watched the entire Reagan radio address. And as other conservative commentators have pointed out, Donald Trump's lucky that Canada didn't play the whole 5 minutes because it's actually harsher than the parts that they took out. Reagan said clearly on that April 25th, 1987 radio address that tariffs destroy America's economy and that trade wars destroy jobs, puts millions of people out of work. Reagan could not have been more clear. And so for Donald Trump to say this is an emergency and we're going to add 10%, and then for the Reagan Foundation to sully themselves by trying to turn Ronald Reagan into some protectionist is, for a lot of people who supported Ronald Reagan, grotesque.
It is. But, Reagan had a lot of opinions on tariffs, but he didn't impose them unilaterally. And I think it's important to step back and, when you're looking at this chaos that has unfolded over this past year on tariffs, this is just a vivid illustration of why we have separation of powers to begin with, why you don't generally see a president impose unilateral tariffs. Because now we have a situation, what would the founding fathers have thought? The president of the United States, his ego is too fragile to put up with an ad quoting Ronald Reagan. So there's more world chaos because of that. I think, this is also just awkward for Americans because, needless to say, Canada is not only our second biggest trading partner, but it is our neighbor. My grandparents were Canadian. Nobody's going to look at Canada and think of them as the enemy. People who live in those border states, actually, Michigan, my family is in Michigan. There's an economy on both sides of the border. This is ridiculous. And I think it's up to the Supreme Court to show that they can follow the separation of powers and make it clear that the president does not have the authority to impose these tariffs unilaterally. Hopefully the American people get an explanation from this court and that the president can get a message from them that's spelled out clearly about the separation of powers. This is really hurting not only other countries, this is hurting Americans right now, especially 27 days into a shutdown.
Well, and Jonathan Lemire, it's also hurting, actually, the Americans' opinion of the Supreme Court, which has been historically low already. But the court hasn't stepped in. The Supreme Court hasn't stepped in on Donald Trump sending Marines out to Los Angeles. They're not stepping in with Donald Trump saying Chicago's a dangerous city and all these other places are dangerous cities. We have to send the National Guard out for basically to make them safer cities, which is for law enforcement. It's not to protect courthouses or ICE. That may be the ultimate justification. You look at tariffs, again, a Ronald Reagan speech that Canada ran that used Reagan. That's an emergency. Is the Supreme Court really going to shame themselves by saying that? This isn't even a close call. You look at Brazil. He liked the authoritarian leader in Brazil who got pushed out. They brought charges. So what happens? Donald Trump starts talking about tariffs and jacking up tariffs with Brazil. This is all deeply, deeply personal. The Supreme Court, by allowing him to do this, is allowing a president of the United States to actually twist tariff powers, take them away from Congress, use them for what he calls emergency purposes, when in fact he's only using them as his own political hammer to go after people who criticize his policies on tariffs. No emergency there. And the court, even this Supreme Court, is going to have to get up off the bench and actually get into the game and clear things up.
And all those issues you just laid out, the Supreme Court choosing, at least to this point, to sit on its hands almost offers its own sort of blessing. But you're right, when this actually comes before them, this is a very difficult defense of these Trump tariffs that his administration will have to make because it is so deeply personal. And Jeff Mason, you and I have covered a couple of Trump terms at this point, and we know how much this foreign policy is shaped by personal relationships. He's talking up now. Xi Jinping, we get along really well, so we'll get that trade deal done. We'll see. But with Canada, it is not that at all. And in fact, Mark Carney is someone who had his first meetings went okay. People around both men have said. But now Trump won't even meet with Carney, who's also in Asia for some of these summits, because he is throwing, let's just say it clear, he's throwing a fit over these tariffs and this ad. And, as how dare you challenge me? So therefore, I need my own form of retribution.
Also, I think important to note that it's Mark Carney who's the interlocutor for these talks with President Trump. It's not the Premier of Ontario. But that's that's a subtlety that President Trump obviously isn't taking seriously. Let's look a little bit about why it was so offensive to him. President Trump likes to be compared favorably to Ronald Reagan. The president moved a portrait of Ronald Reagan that was in the grand foyer of the White House into the Oval Office. And now it's in nearly every single shot of him in the Oval Office, at least when he's standing up behind a podium. He does not like the suggestion that there's a difference between his conservatism and what more probably traditional conservatives see as the hero of their party and of their movement, which was Ronald Reagan and his philosophy. So the Ontario premier used both that weakness or that sort of vulnerability and the power of television through a television ad to really get under the president's skin. And as we've seen, anything that gets under the president's skin will lead him to make policy judgments and policy decisions. And in this case, it was on tariffs that will affect both countries and prices for Americans until something comes or happens that can bring that temperature down again. And it probably will. I mean, look at how many times the president has backtracked in talks with Canada, and the same with many other countries. But right now, tensions are high.
Well, and at the same time, Peter Baker, again, when that case is argued before the Supreme Court, of course, those that are going to argue against, quote, the emergency that's compelling the president to seize his power from Congress, has this, whether he backs down ultimately or not, has this data point to show that Donald Trump uses tariffs and hiking tariffs for every other reason under the sun other than an economic emergency.
Right. He loves tariffs because they are, at least to date anyway, unchecked power. Right. This is what an executive like him wants. He wants to be able to make decisions with a snap of a finger. I tariff you because I don't like this. I tariff you because I don't like that, without having to actually go to Congress, without having to make a legal finding, without having to go through a process, without having to do anything to justify it specifically other than his own mood of the moment. Whether the Supreme Court, continues to allow that to go forward or not, we'll see. But that's why he likes it, because it seems so unchecked. And it's just, we saw these protests, no kings, the other day. Well, this is a kind of kingly power, right? Where he doesn't have to get anybody else's approval or anybody else's concurrence. But the consequence of this, aside from consumers, by the way, it's also for businesses. I was having dinner the other night with these executives from a major company, and they said, well, there's no way we can make a decision based on, what's happening with tariffs. How do we know what the tariffs are going to be next year, much less next week, the way he goes things? So if you're going to try to build a factory, if you're going to try to make long-term plans for what your business is going to do, are you going to have jobs here or overseas, which in theory is what these tariffs are supposed to be about? You're left kind of stuck in this uncertain moment because he literally changes his mind by the day.
Chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Peter Baker, thank you so much. And as we are showing those pictures of Donald Trump, it just, again, let's not forget, you can march and say we don't want kings. There are two reasons why the head of the second branch of our government is able to do that. And that's because the cowardice of the first branch and the cowardice of the third branch. If either of those two stepped in, and if the Supreme Court actually stopped stalling and letting Donald Trump act the way he's acting in this ambiguous world, legal world that they're allowing, whether it's with him sending Marines to Los Angeles or whether it's sending National Guard troops to these cities that he says they need to be sent there to drive crime down, clearly unconstitutional on both sides of that. If they'd step in, or if the first branch of government, Congress, Article 1, first branch, if they would step in and actually say, no, Constitution, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, they gave us the power to impose tariffs, we wouldn't have this issue. But it's complete cowardice by the first and the third branches of government that allow the second branch to continue to expand its powers. That's simple.